So basically today I'm going to talk about the work that I presented at LPSC this year. It was a collaboration between our group at the University of Hawaii and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where they have this really huge transmission electron microscope. Basically, we were looking at one single meteorite, and I've tried to make this talk not so geological. I took out all the data, just left in the pictures, aimed it at a 5-year-old. So I'm hoping that the biologists will still be able to understand what I'm talking about. I didn't mean that in an insulting way. Okay, so the aim of the project was really to compare the chemistry and mineralogy of the Martian and terrestrial alteration phases in this single meteorite, which is called the Miller Range 090032, on micrometer scale. So as I said, using a transmission electron microscope. So are the minerals that we find in the terrestrial alteration and the Martian alteration similar? Is their chemistry similar? What are the water-rock ratios of the two environments like? Are they similar? And ultimately, are the Antarctic dry valleys a really good analog, the best analog on Earth for the environment that formed these Martian alteration minerals? Oops. Okay, so this is our meteorite. It was collected in 2009 in the Antarctic dry valleys in the Miller Range region by the Antarctic Search for Meteorites team, which I think they covered a little bit this morning. So the mineralogy and chemistry designate it as a Martian basaltic meteorite, which means, for those of you who aren't geologists, it's kind of like a lava that you would get in Hawaii or anyway. It's an eruptive lava, and it has these minerals in them known as olivines here. The really interesting thing about this specific Martian meteorite is it's in the group the knocklites. All that means is that inside these olivine grains, which are shown this bright grain here, you get these kind of darker gray areas that are Martian clay. I'm going to say clay like this, because it's not really clay, but it's just, you don't need to know all that. We'll just say clay for now. Okay, so how do we know they're Martian? Well, in very specific areas in this meteorite, you get a cross-cutting relationship between these clay veins and this fusion crust material. Fusion crust is what's formed when the meteorite comes in through the atmosphere and the outside of the meteorite gets melted. So you get this crustal area with lots of bubbles in it, and it's just a melting of the meteorite itself. And you can see that these veins in certain areas, they abut against the fusion crust, and they're devolatilized, so they get bubbles in them. They look like they've melted. In this case, one of them's kind of warped with the heat here. If they were formed after the meteorite came in through the atmosphere, then you would expect that they would cut across this fusion crust and we wouldn't see any kind of melting or anything. So we know that they're Martian. But the problem is, how do we distinguish these Martian clay veins from the terrestrial alteration minerals that are formed in the Antarctic, which are often quite similar in terms of chemical composition? Nobody's really looked at this in so much detail before. There's been one paper in 2011 that attempted to do the same thing that I did with different meteorites, but they concentrated on Martian meteorites that were falls, so things that hadn't been sat around on Earth, and they were just looking at the Martian material. What we really wanted to do was make a comparison between the Martian alteration material and the stuff that's formed in Antarctica. So we concentrated on a tiny area in our meteorite. If I just go back, I can show you what I mean by that. Okay, so say this is our whole meteorite stone. When you take a thin section, it's a 30-micron thick slice of rock that you then mount onto a glass slide. So you can look under a microscope or an electron microscope. When you take a FIB section, you basically take this is the whole thin section, so we're talking about 1 centimeter across here. and the thickness of this thin section is going to be 30 microns. When you take a FIB section of something, you have to focus in on a target area in the thin section and decide which area you want to focus in on. So for us, we picked this area here. This is the terrestrially exposed edge of the meteorite, and this is a gypsum grain. It shows it better in this false color image. It's this white grain there. It's along a crack, and it's next to the terrestrial exposed area, so we assumed that was terrestrial. And if we focus in a little bit more, so this is just an electron microscope image of the gypsum grain. You can see this crack here, and you can also see that it's next to one of these olivine grains that I pointed out with some pre-terrestrial Martian clay. So we focus in a tiny bit more. This is that olivine. This is the pre-terrestrial clay, which is labeled IDD there. Just ignore that. It's because it's sometimes called Iddingite. It has many names because it's not really clay. So this is the area we took our FIB section from, and this image here just shows how you take a FIB section from a thin section. Basically, you drill down and make a vertical section, which is what this line shows. You make 2 trenches either side, and you take out something that is around 10 microns by about 5 microns deep. And in the bottom image, it's around 50 nanometers thick, so it's a tiny little wafer. You have to do this with a micromanipulator, because by this stage, you can't see it. So you can't, if you drop it, then you're screwed. Okay, so we've got our FIB section, and because it's so wafer thin, you can then put it in the transmission electron microscope, and it creates an image because the electrons actually pass straight through it. For this type of image, anything that appears bright is dense, because the electrons are being backscattered. Anything that appears a darker color is less dense, so more electrons get through. So here, we cut through an area that was partly Martian clay and partly terrestrial alteration. And when we looked at the chemistry of these phases, we found that, well, first of all, you can see there's a really clear boundary there between the two. So this is the Martian side, and this is the terrestrial side. When we looked at the chemistry, you can see that the Martian side, it is actually real clay. That was quite surprising to us, because the people who studied this before, they said they hadn't found clay in any of the sections. They found more amorphous silicate material that didn't have any structure. It's an iron-rich clay, and probably a lot of you would have heard of the Mars Curiosity rover recently found smectite clay on the surface of Mars. Well, we found it first because it's in this meteorite. So yeah, I mean, it kind of confirmed what we'd already found, but this is a non-tranite smectite clay, which is exactly the kind of stuff that they found on the surface of Mars in the Gale crater. On the terrestrial side, it's very different in this FIB section. We've got something called jarosite, which is a sulfate. It's an iron-potassium sulfate. Lots of slightly altered olivine, and by that I just mean it's olivine, but it has some sulfur in it, weirdly, which olivine never normally has sulfur in there. And then these kind of bright vein areas, they're iron oxides and hydroxides. So that was the first FIB section. If we focus in on the Martian phyllosilicate, or clay, as I was saying, it's got structure. So the reason we can identify it as a smectite clay is because if you really focus down, which is something that you can only do really with a transmission electron microscope, you can see on the scale of angstroms. So here we've got the fringes here, and each fringe between here and here is roughly 10 angstroms, and that identifies this clay as a smectite, specifically as a non-tranite. It is poorly ordered, so the images are not fantastic. If you looked at a terrestrial clay, they would be just lines going straight across here. But we do have some structure. Okay, so, oops. So we also looked at a second area. So again, we're looking at this gypsum grain. This area at the bottom of the gypsum grain to me looked really interesting because not only have we got gypsum, but there's also these other layers in there. And I couldn't identify these with any other method because they're so narrow. So I thought, okay, we'll make a FIB section there and see whether this gray area is actually a clay that was formed in the Antarctic. So this is our second FIB section. We've got the gypsum grain here. We've got the layer next to the gypsum grain, which is very rich in, again, sulfates, which seems to be a trend with the Antarctic alteration material. And then we've got two layers, actually, in this what I thought could be clay region. But it actually turns out to be amorphous. There's no structure in here. When we zoomed in, there was no phyllosilicate fringes there at all. It's just an amorphous silicate. It is very rich in iron, and it's quite rich in manganese and sulfur, but there's no structure there. The interesting thing about that is you only get structural phyllosilicates when the water-rock ratio goes above a certain threshold. Below that, you still get alteration, but you get this amorphosized material because it's kind of like a stunted material. This is why people weren't surprised to find it on Mars, because we know that there's not much water hanging around on Mars. But in the Antarctic, it's surprising that we see the amorphous material as the Antarctic alteration, whereas there's material in there that's Martian and is phyllosilicate. Okay, so some of the main conclusions that we got from this work. Well, we found out that the Martian clay is actually clay. It's a smectite clay known as nontronite, the same stuff that MSL's found on Mars. Something I didn't talk about was the fact that this meteorite, from the chemistry of the Martian clay, we could determine that the meteorite actually came from very close to the surface of Mars. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but it kind of it helps us to determine how the fluids formed in this certain group of meteorites. But the really important thing that we found was the fact that actually in the Antarctic, the water-rock ratio in this specific meteorite was lower than it was when these Martian alteration clays formed. So it could be that the Antarctic is actually drier than the surface of Mars, or at least at the time that these clays were formed. Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, I have a two-part question. So you're comparing the Martian and the Antarctic alteration, but the Iddingite in the Nacklites is like a combination. It's mostly primary alteration of the minerals and then a little bit of secondary deposition. So all of your terrestrial stuff is like secondary precipitation out of fluids. It's not actually altering the minerals. So like are the conditions of the alteration really comparable? Like, so what I mean is that this altered because it was sitting on the surface and fluids kind of percolated through it and deposited sulfates and things like that. But the Nacklites were altered at depth from hydrothermal fluids going through them for a long period of time and actually primary altering the olivine. So like we find jarosite on the surface of Mars from like basically the exact same setting, a really dry, just fluid precipitation. But is this really like a comparable analog? Because the environment and the type of alteration that the actual rust is totally different.
Yeah, okay, so so in terms of the sulfates, yes, I would agree with you. The sulfates that we find in the Antarctic, they are depositional. You can see that because on the meteorite, if you get an external surface, they kind of like grade inwards. So they are mostly terrestrial in this meteorite, and they do come from small amounts of water on the surface. And we actually published a paper. Maybe there's a lot of biogenic material in the Antarctic in the atmosphere. So a lot of the sulfur and a lot of the salts do come from the atmosphere and from precipitation of water. But when you said that that the fluids in the Antarctic doesn't actually alter the minerals, I don't think that's true for. I don't know if I can go back now. I don't think it's true for all of the minerals because the amorphous material that we found, that's not depositional. It's not from things coming in from the outside of the meteorite. The chemistry of that and the Martian phyllosilicate material, the Iddingite, it's exactly the same. It is an alteration of.
So are you saying that the amorphous gel is terrestrial?
It's terrestrial, but It's from alteration of the primary minerals in the Martian meteorite.
Are you sure? Because all the other naclites have amorphous gel that has the same composition as the clays that is Martian.
Yes, it's Martian. Yes, exactly. We know that it's terrestrial because of the manganese content. It's next to a clinopyroxene that's been altered, and the clinopyroxene contains a small amount of manganese. The clay, the pre-terrestrial clay, doesn't contain any manganese. And just texturally, you can tell that it's terrestrial. The paper that published the amorphous gel material, that was all inside the Idding-site veins. We do actually have a paper coming out. It's difficult to explain everything in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.